have another group member or two join us, but I think we could go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, good afternoon. And this is meeting number 5 of the I-77 Express Lanes Local Advisory Group. I'm Peg Carlson, your facilitator for the series of meetings from UNC School of Government. And as we have with each meeting, I just want to take a minute to start with reviewing the purpose of this group as well as introductions for who's here. Okay, so a reminder, what this group is here to do is to provide that important local perspective on the options from the Mercator report. Analyzing those and providing your feedback is one of the things that now by this meeting you are going to be deep into. And we'll talk more about the agenda in a minute, but that you started really doing that analysis of the first few options at the last meeting after spending the first few meetings hearing a lot of information to help you do that, and you'll continue that discussion today with ultimately the purpose then to provide that feedback and input to the secretary to help them make a decision on what to do with this project. So, roles. Let's start with the members of the local advisory group, and then we can make introductions for the other folks in the room. So if we could go around the table, your name and the organization and jurisdiction you represent.
Jim Puckett with Beckford County.
Kurt Knobs, Town of Cornelius.
Jim Taylor with Mercator Advisors.
Jim Trotman, DOT.
Louis Mitchell, Chief Engineer's Office.
Bo Memory, Turnpike Authority.
Mike Russell with Huntersville.
John Edward, White Woman Champ.
Mark Brady, Moores of South Island.
Thank you. And we have a few additional members from DOT and NC Turnpike Authority in the room as well.
I'm Carly Alexic with NCDOT Communications. Nicole Meister, NCDOT Communications.
David Roy, Turnpike Authority.
Okay, and we have members of our RSNH team who are providing the input.
Adam Dawson with RSNH. Rob Swain Popular, RSNH.
And I'm Peg Carlson. So I think for the ground rules today, I'm anticipating in terms of my role as facilitator, one of the things that I want to be sure to do is help you share the air. We want to be getting everyone's input as well as everyone's questions that you have to help you digest this information and talk about how you think it will affect those that you represent. And so there might be times that I'll be stepping in and asking for people that we haven't heard from yet. I think that's going to be a key ground rule for today, as well as always focusing on interest, being sure to share your reasoning and what it is that you think is most important to take into consideration with this project. So for today's agenda, first thing that you will hear is the status of some information requests. In each meeting there have been questions that have been raised, requests that you have to gather more information to help you with this process. And so in just a minute I'm going to turn it over to Radha, who will be talking about what the status is of the information that you requested in the March 14th meeting. You received several things by email. I believe those are also here in hard copy, and then let you know when you can expect to hear on the other ones. And then the bulk of today's meeting is really going to be going back into those policy option assessments. So in meeting number 4, you heard the cost, approval, schedule impacts for option A, B, C1, and C2. And after each of those, you identified pros and cons about each of those options based on what you heard. So we're going to continue that same process today. It seemed to work pretty well for folks. And so we will be starting up then with the analysis of C3, 4, and 5, D, E, and F. And the goal is to get through all of the rest of the options today, with you being able to analyze pros and cons of each of those, leaving anticipating then meeting 6 to be a place where you can really start looking at, comparing, discussing them side by side. And that's going to be one of the last things then for today, will be to introduce an evaluation matrix that then will be filled in more and discussed for meeting number 6. So, how does that sound? Anything that you expected that was going to happen today that you didn't hear in that description? All right. Then I will turn it over to Radha for the status of information requests.
Thank you. My co-presenter Phil, he could not be here today due to a prior commitment, so I'm going to be filling in his slides as well as my slides. And Turnpike, Jim or Adam, please feel free to chime in if I miss anything on any of those slides. So let's start with information requested at the last meeting. Again, I'm Radha Swayam. At meeting number 4, there were several items that were requested. The items listed on the left are the 2 items that you received information from through an email that Carly sent yesterday. Items listed on the right were the items that we are still working on. We were hoping, even until yesterday, to kind of maybe have 1 or 2 items provided, sent to you, but the time we had since the last meeting was very short. We barely had 2 weeks, so we could really gather everything together in addition to preparing for this meeting. But we hope to have the information listed on the right soon, hopefully before the next meeting, if not certainly at the next meeting. Any questions on that before I get into the meat of the meeting? Okay. First, we will start with the Mercator options. Again, I'm not going to go through the options.
I'm sorry, are we going to talk about some of the things that were provided? Is that are we jumping into the options now? Because I do have some questions about the corridor cap.
Can certainly talk about it right now.
Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead. And then if it turns into a bigger discussion, maybe decide if they want to save it for the end, but certainly initial questions right now.
So as I sent a couple emails, the corridor cap language, correct me if I'm wrong, it applies to any contiguous project or group of projects. And you're interpreting that as a contiguous project, and then there's a separate group of projects. And you've gone to the legislative analyst and said that's their interpretation. And I have to tell you that the First Circuit Court of Appeals has found your interpretation to be wrong. There was an exact grammatical construction like that in the state of Maine, and the court ruled that no, in fact, contiguous, in our case, would modify both. And the reason I bring that up is because that's one of the key barriers that we've had in this being ranked for STIs. We always say, you know what, it's going to bump up against the corridor cap because of I-77 South. In our case, I think it actually makes sense to have contiguous makes more sense modifying group of projects than it does project. So I don't know what the recourse is to say there's actual legal precedent to say that your interpretation is incorrect. Go back and take a look at the interpretation.
I can jump on that. I think the fiscal analysts were answering the question of what did they believe the legislative intent was. If it would help, we can certainly go back to the transportation chairs, co-chairs, and the bill sponsors of SDI and say, was your intent exactly what the fiscal analysts described? Because I think that would better answer your question. What was the legislative intent in that language?
I think the ultimate answer is we actually did, and this is what the state of Maine did, is if the legislative intent is, as you all are saying it is, then you actually have a bill that changes the language in the statute. And it would read something like any contiguous project or any non-contiguous group of projects, and then that would be clear, right? That's really what your interpretation is. That the group of projects doesn't have to be contiguous to fall under the corridor cap. We could have something in Mount Airy and something bordering on the South Carolina border, and that would fall under the corridor cap, right?
Yes,
So those are
Yeah, I
the
mean,
same
we can
things.
certainly ask the
I'll
question.
go
Yeah.
back to the legislature chairs, transportation chairs.
Because I think most people would look at that and reasonably conclude, as the First Circuit Court of Appeals had, that in fact you're talking about a contiguous project as well as a contiguous group of projects, which case the corridor cap would not apply to I-77 north because it's not contiguous with I-77 south.
This is state legislation, so any federal legislation, federal court ruling, or anything in Maine wouldn't apply to North Carolina legislation.
Except that it was a state, that it's exactly the situation because it was state legislation that was legislated in federal court.
So we'll
So-
take it.
But if indeed the language is, as you interpret it, they could simply remedy it, perhaps on a prospective basis, but they could remedy it by simply
Correct, just changing
language
the
to be
statute.
consistent with what the interpretation is.
The law is supposed to provide precision and clarity, and it's not doing it.
Mr. Secretary, you talked about, taking it back to the appropriation, I'm assuming you're talking about Torbett, Nyland, Shepherd, or what is that group today? I guess I don't know the new names of the new guys.
Transportation is Torbert, Shepherd, Eiler, and Senate is Davis, McGinnis, and President.
So did they not replace Tynes? Because there was 4 at one time, Torbett, Eiler, Shepherd, and Tynes.
No, I think he was on transportation oversight.
Okay.
I brought up last time, and I bring it up again, especially since Kirk brought this up about the presidents of the federal court, to possibly also include our attorney general for an opinion from his office on this, if there's still, I just bring that up as something for you to, because they certainly give opinions on these kind of things all the time. So
Okay.
I just ask you to keep that in mind.
Okay. Continue. Back to the slides. So these are the same options that I've been looking at, and like I mentioned, the last minute, we went through A, B, C1, C2, so we are going to start at C3 for today's presentation. In terms of assessment factors, these are the same factors. Again, looked at last meeting, basically looked at each of these factors for options and talked about what are the potential impacts for each of these factors. Then we came back and talked about pros and cons for the given option. So the intention is we'll go through the same way. So I'll not really get into details of these options, but these are the same slides we had last time. First, cost impacts, just like how we talked about cost impacts for each option last time. We will do the same thing for the remaining options today. In terms of approvals for scope and funding, the same 5 different approvals that we looked at the last few meetings, we will look at them for the remaining options today too. And finally, we will talk about the schedule impacts. Anytime we are talking about schedule, just as a reminder, we're always talking about what is the impact for us to have an open facility along I-77. So that's the impact that we are looking at for each option. So we'll start with C3. C3 is basically revising the contract so that some of the truck restrictions could be modified. Right now, as laid out in the contract, any vehicles with more than 2 axles or more than certain dimensions are not allowed in these express lanes. This option would modify them, and exactly how it modifies needs to be discussed and decided, but one of the idea that was considered under this is maybe this option would allow what you consider as box trucks or those trailers with the trucks with the landscape trailers, things like that would be allowed on the I-77 express lanes without requiring us to redo the pavement conditions of the express lanes. So with that said, if that's the direction we are heading on cost impacts, we kind of, for several options we were able to give the cost impact, but this one we are saying it's a TBD, to be determined, mainly because we need to define exactly what is the vehicle type that's going to be allowed, and then what is the tolling for those vehicles. Would we keep the tolling for those vehicles the same as other vehicles, or would we charge more or less for those vehicles? So those parameters need to be discussed and decided before cost impacts could be determined. Depending on those parameters, this option may come as neutral, or this option may come as slightly higher or lower on revenue. But right now, we don't know that number exactly. As we move into scope and funding approvals, these are the same 5 items that we looked at for each option in terms of scope and funding. STI project prioritization is the one that we are saying no, because based on the limited information we have, we are hoping, or at least we are looking at not having any additional funding needs, so we don't have to go through project prioritization for this. However, all that could change once you define exactly what type of trucks are going to be allowed. But if we stick to the assumption that these are going to be box trucks and trucks like that, we hopefully don't have to go through the STA project prioritization, but we still need to go through and get some of the other approvals, starting with the revising the MTP project list and going to the air quality conformity, environmental document, and approvals. However, the way we are looking at this for schedule impacts is we are not looking at stopping, or at least the way we are looked at is not really stopping the construction. The project would continue, the facility would be open when it is scheduled to be, whenever exact restrictions are defined and decided, approvals would be pursued. Once you receive the approvals, you will go back and change the signs so that those vehicle types could be allowed on the express lanes. Could that happen at the same time when the facility is open? Possibly. Or would it be 6 months or 5 months after the facility open? Possibly. It depends when we make the decision, what are the types of trucks. But this is not pending on stopping the construction or reinitiating the construction or going back to STI. Like you may remember from the last meeting, once you go back to the STI project prioritization, we are looking for quite a bit of schedule impact. This does not involve that. So I'll take a pause there. Yes, sir.
How are they gonna determine what type of specific truck? Are they gonna look at the depth of the concrete, asphalt, I guess concrete, and decide what kind of weight it can bear per vehicle? Is that how they're gonna do it, or, I mean, what's gonna be North DOT's mind frame there?
I can share some answer, or if somebody wants to. Based on the discussions we have or the way that is defined right now, we are not looking at redoing the pavement. That means, at least for this option, what can be allowed with the pavement that we are putting in I-77 is, like what I said, box trucks like FedEx and UPS trucks, and small trucks that have the landscape trailers. Those would not really require us to redo the pavement. So that's really where the discussion has been so far. I don't know if there is anything else Luis or anybody wants to share or add to that. That answer?
So I guess, so we're gonna figure out how much weight that thickness of concrete can hold then, and that's what we're gonna determine, we're gonna come up, because I mean, a box truck, you know, theoretically, it shouldn't weigh more than 26,000 pounds, but it theoretically could weigh more than 26,000 pounds. So,
Yes.
Yeah, maybe an easy way to think of it would be any trucks that don't have an 18,000-pound axle load. So
Or non-CDL,
yes.
so it'd be
Well, it may-
26,000 and under.
There may be CDL like buses and things like that that wouldn't even come close to that weight. Those could be allowed. So it's what's the maximum size that we'd go to without it getting close to 18,000 pounds on an axle load.
I'm just trying to understand, because we had this discussion a little bit in the last meeting, and that was that if we allow the 18-wheelers on that, that would be permissible. It would just, as we said, chew up the pavement, or the longevity would be down. So I'm just I'm trying to reconcile in my head, what is the difference between C3 and the box trucks? And then are we gonna look at the option of C3 prime, which is 18-wheelers accepting a lesser maintenance?
Another consideration will be the gross vehicle weight, the stopping distance, and the speed. So if you have, let's say for example, you had a fully loaded tractor trailer at 80,000 pounds, he's in the express lanes, 70 miles an hour, and someone comes in from the ingress and egress lanes, there's probably not enough stopping distance if they're not traveling fast enough, and he has no capability. So there'll be an analysis on safety stopping distance, but I'll almost guarantee you that tractor trailers won't work unless you have a barrier separated with only ingress and egress at direct access.
to your point.
That's typically those facilities are built
I think
that
that's,
way.
yeah, that's so clear.
Yeah, and we are running the analysis now on the pavement and sort of web support to answer the question that came up last time. It just takes some time to do
Well,
that,
I'm
but we'll hopefully have it
I'm
the next
perfectly
meeting.
okay with that. I think the issues, that's a big if 18-wheelers, if it changes everything, if 18-wheelers can be in those lanes, or the 18-wheelers will not be in, and if safety issues say, hey, they can't be in that lane because of safety issues, I think that's a big variable that needs to come to this committee.
Yes, sir.
So if I remember correctly, the way the ingress and egress points are laid out, at 28, we've got about 600 feet to get in. So there's really no way that we could have a truck in the express lanes north of, mile marker 26, probably, because there would be no stopping distance in there as it's coming along. It
Yeah.
goes from 2 express lanes down to 1. There's a short ingress.
Yeah, and I
Distance
don't recall
into
the distance off the top of my head, but certainly all of that would be factored into that, and we can bring that back here.
So from a design, so really from the way it's designed right now, from a safety standpoint, we can't put an 18-wheeler in the express lanes right now.
I personally don't think you're gonna be able to put anything other than a single axle, 26,000-pound left truck over there. I mean, I run trucks all the time, and you're gonna beat that pavement up if you put anything more than 26,000-pound non-CDL over there.
So it gets chewed up in 10 years, and then we put the right pavement in.
Well, that could be a plus. We could do tractor trailers and get it done in 12 months, probably.
So it sounds like you all are starting to get into some of the evaluation of this option, which is fine, that's where we want to go next. So let me just check, are there any other questions that people have about what RADA has shared before you are ready to jump in and start listing pros and cons on this one?
There's just a lot of unknowns to go too far and go around this road. There's a lot of unknowns on the right side there, and unknowns what we're talking about, so it's hard to really weigh in with any significant value.
And that in itself, I'm thinking maybe a downside to this one. Is that fair to say that it's?
As of today,
As of
yes.
today, it's hard to do an analysis of what this would mean without that.
Okay, well, I'll speak, and I don't know if it's pro or con, it may be more editorial. Two points. One, this option clearly doesn't look at anticipate taking the 18-wheelers off of the general purpose lane. So to the Secretary's point, and this is interesting, when we talk about that we could not safely put 18-wheelers because of stopping distances into the toll lane because of the speed, there is the assumption then that those speeds will never be attained in the general purpose lane. Therefore, we can leave them there and it must be safe, which the trucking industry will probably tell you they have a bit of a problem with. They have an interstate that they cannot, by our own definition, maintain the speed limit. So as they start to figure out truck times, delivery times, et cetera, they now have to anticipate what the speed limit will be because it won't be what was posted. It also tends to make it sound like the general purpose lanes are less safe than the toll lanes. So I just put that out there as for what it's worth. That really doesn't speak to this other than if you're leaving the 18-wheelers in general purpose, and this option does, I don't know that you gain a whole lot other than just you take a little bit more congestion off of the general purpose. So I don't see this as really a terribly viable option just because I don't think it accomplishes a whole lot one way or the other. Unless I was a landscaper, in which case it might. It's a pretty narrow band of upside, and it sounds like there's some
Minimal gain
downside.
might be a way to put on the board, a minimal
Yeah,
gain.
minimal gain, and
Well, or another way you could phrase it, and say it's a pro, is whatever is done in modification that allows more trucks, no matter what the size, moderately, bigger than what's, allowed today, would be more, allowing and less restrictive. So we just don't know what that answer is, but in general, it would allow more access to the lane and be less restrictive.
I have a question, really, and I apologize for missing the last meeting, but Commissioner Coppin touched on it. I watched some of the video about the traffic studies that we did study of how many trucks, is there a number of the trucks? And then taking the trucks down and understanding the peak time of the truck travel? Do we have those numbers? Is that,
Sure,
Yes,
there
we
is-
do. Yes, we
yeah.
have.
is that something we could see?
Yes.
And I'm assuming, just to make sure we answer this, it's not just trucks, it's the types and sizes of trucks that would be of interest as well.
My curiosity is, what's the number of 18-wheelers at the highest commuter traffic
Right.
time?
They're not out there at the highest
Well,
community.
that's-
They're sitting at the
that's
truck
right.
stop waiting to clear out, I
Right,
can tell
that's,
you.
well, they gotta sit there all day.
They're running at night, and they're running
Right.
from 10 to 2 and 3, and then they're back in off the road, and they're coming again back out at 8, and running from 8 to 5 or 6 in the morning. That's how they do it when you come down through here. You don't, unless you just absolutely got to, you do not get out in when it's time for rush hour.
Well, we are taking counts. That's what the small situation was last week when it was a possible bomb scare. It was a traffic camera measuring the traffic and identifying the demographic.
Other thoughts either on what this option may gain, may get you, and what would be the downsides? What I have so far is that it allows more access to the lane, it's less restrictive than the original scope. Downsides, difficult to know at this point exactly what it would mean for whom without some of those specifics on weight and size, and it's not clear that there'd be a lot of gain for the.
To be fair, it's minimal cost, right, and doesn't delay the opening, just so that we're completely, minimal or zero cost, I guess, if we're doing the same thing.
Minimal cost doesn't delay the opening.
I mean, all things being equal, if we weren't gonna change anything, we'd rather have that than nothing. Though, again, it goes back to my comment last week of being 20 points down and kicking a field goal.
Others, for either side, no requirement for consensus on these, so. If you have a different thought, it's fine to share it. Okay, you ready to go on to C4?
Okay. C4 is, again, another modification. This option would modify the contract so that HOT 2+ vehicles could be allowed for some period. Right now, the contract, the project would allow HOT 3+. That means vehicles with 3 or more passengers to ride for free in express lanes. With this option, vehicles with 2 or more passengers could use the facility for free for a period of time. That could help the transition, allow people slowly get used to express lanes and hopefully uplane transponders and get used to the facility. So what does that mean to the impact? From a cost standpoint, we are looking at this as, again, another low cost impact. We put this in the category that we looked at last week, or last meeting, less than $50 million bucket. And however, the $50 million, the impact is absolutely dependent on how long this is going to be allowed. The assumption is it would be allowed for a small amount of people. Depending on that, the impact may change. And we don't, with this option, we're not really expecting any construction costs other than changing some signs. Everything kind of remains the same. In terms of approvals, however, you do need to go through the process. Again, because there is not a significant cost impact, it doesn't need to go through the STI project prioritization, but it has to go through the CRTPO project list because it requires that list to be changed, and then go through the air quality conformity revisions to the environmental documentation, even though we don't expect that to be significant, but it's something that has to be done, and to get the approvals so that this could be done.
Question what the based on performance means. Are we basing that on how many vehicles have two passengers in it? Or, I mean, how are we gonna evaluate performance?
So the way I read this is that when they say based on performance, it would basically be, assuming that that, you know, that the HOT 2+ users don't flood the lanes and, you know, degrade the 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. So it would basically be on that base, you know, are they able to maintain the 45-mile-an-hour guaranteed travel time, or not?
I guess, and then, and taking that out further, if you could maintain the 45-mile-an-hour travel speed, then based on the way this is written, at some point in time, you would bump it up to 3, or is there a possibility to leave it at 2?
I think that would depend on the cost associated with it. You know, at some point, the cost of that would be so significant that I think it would warrant DOT to have to look at that through their prioritization process.
So, to that point, when you said 50 million isn't not much in context of,
Yes.
But it all depends on the number of years. In other words, if it's 45 million, but it only gets you 3 years, that's not insignificant for 3 years now. I don't think it's that much. Some years.
Thank you. That answer your question?
Sorry. So, in terms of schedule, this is similar to the previous one. This does not really require us to stop construction. The facility could potentially be open as it is planned right now. Once the approvals are obtained, this modification could be in place. And again, depending on how fast those approvals could happen, hopefully this would happen pretty much on the day one. If not, maybe this is a change that would happen at that point when the approvals are obtained. Dad, have any questions, or are you ready for Peg to talk about the pros and cons of this?
Based on the current HOV, I would say this is irrelevant. I don't see it changing $3 an hour. If you look at the current HOV as it stands today in use on I-77, it is a complete nightmare. I don't know that extending it north is going to make it any better.
So not likely to make much of a difference in terms of the load.
Right. So much so, I think you could make an HOV lane, not a toll lane, and it would still be. Thus guaranteeing the travel time for mass transit. But I just think it's a non-issue.
I think there was another with the question you had, Ms. Cash and Mr. Kern. I think there was one that comes out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat along the same lines that Commissioner Huggins spoke of. And then I think to offer it to 2 riders and then try to change it to 3 is more like monkeying with the system than it is effective. That just causes confusion if there's anyone who's going to use it.
So it could cause confusion to change after a certain period of time.
I think another con in that too is I think they're gonna claim a whole lot greater loss than we can gain. So for what you're gonna get, it's gonna cost you through the nose in that contract with them.
The meaning, Centra,
Yes.
okay.
True.
They're gonna ask for millions.
certain period of time. Is that,
I think that is one of the options that was discussed and one of the options that's still on the table.
okay. Is that, is it an element of this one?
Not of this particular option, it's one of the ones we went through last week, but
Yeah.
it's something that will still be part of the conversation.
Still
certainly.
considered, okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thanks.
I believe that was considered part of the discounts
Okay.
options, I think C2.
It was,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, others on this? Anything else worth discussing? Okay.
We go to the last option of the modifying series, C5. This is mainly to modify compensation provisions that are listed in the contract right now for unplanned revenue impacting facilities. The first couple of lines are just to kind of remind you of what the option is, or the unplanned revenue impacting facilities are. Right now, the contract allows the developer to seek compensation if a main line is added within the right-of-way of I-77. At the same time, any planned facilities at the time of contract execution, with the exception of one, which is adding a general purpose lane between exit 28 and 36, do not qualify for unplanned revenue impacting facilities. What this option could do is modify to evaluate a time period so that improvements such as a similar improvement could be incorporated. And it's kind of difficult to talk about the impacts of this because we don't know exactly what that improvement we are talking about. It hasn't really been defined, but based on the limited information we have, we put this into the less than $50 million, that means again, minimal impact bucket. However, if the improvement is adding a mainline facility, obviously, it could very well exceed the $50 million bucket we are looking at for this option. So it's kind of important for us to define exactly what that is before we can absolutely confirm the cost impacts of that. When you go to the scope and funding approvals, any of those improvements are basically considered outside I-77 project. So the project construction could go on under this option, the facility could open. You don't really need to have any of those approvals specific to that improvement, but you do need those approvals for whatever improvement you identify, depending on when that improvement is going to be implemented. That repeating some of the information again on the schedule impacts, because again, this does not really require stopping the construction. Contract modifications would basically happen once you identify that specific improvement. Once you identify that improvement, you do need to do additional studies like we looked at the previous slide for the approvals, traffic analysis, the environmental documentation, so that those improvements could receive the approvals for the implementation of them. But that does not obviously impact anything happening on I-77. Any questions before we go into talking about pros and cons of this option?
Ready to weigh in on this one?
It's a big con that the state can't, fill any more jobs first, without compensating the contractor. But it's, and then anything north of 28, that's gonna be the most expensive general purpose lanes that the state's ever built, because we're giving up the only dry land right now. to pay them for that too? No?
It's not in the right of way.
So the improvements apply to controlled access in the corridor. I don't know how we define corridor.
It's the airspace. Airspace is a contract.
So this option is basically paying for now the right to add competing facilities essentially sometime in the future.
With the hopes that it would be cheaper now versus why would, or why would you do that now if you were not intending to?
So you certainly have the right, and it's assuming that it would be cheaper now to do so. You
Much
have to
like we
be
said, it
making
was
that assumption.
cheaper
So
to
it's
cancel the contract.
lower
today.
risk.
So what would be the mechanism to come up with that? You know, is it, we wanna say we wanna add a general purpose lane from downtown to 28. So that'd be 14 miles or whatever.
So it would be a negotiation with, through the CA on, okay, here's the proposal, here's what we think this will look like, here's the time frame that it would occur in, and then the concessionaire would come back and say, here's what we believe the price is, and that would be the negotiation, but it would be present dollars, not future dollars.
Now, and they'd have to prove the impact. I mean, after it opens, they'd have to prove that there was impact, to get to the value of it.
So, but, well, just to clarify, in our first meeting, we talked about, the completion of Highway 21, it makes it 28 north. That is not a competing project with this.
No.
If you're gonna write a check now, presumably you wouldn't have uncertainty at the time the project.
Exactly.
facility opened.
I think that would be the benefit of this, is that you essentially buy the right before they could prove a harm. Now, you're paying for potential loss that may or may not be there, but you're getting rid of the uncertainty for the future for planning purposes. And two, you're taking the risk, you're removing some of the risk in the fact that if it proves to be more valuable, that you've got the certainty of the now versus the uncertainty of the.
It's kind of a catch-22, right? For those of us who are up here, we kind of say, you almost open it and see how few people who are gonna use it. And then it lowers the cost versus if it's heavily used, it raises the cost.
But so, to your point, kind of gets into the whole risk. I mean, the project could fail. That's one reason there was risk shifting by the party, which means you would have paid money for something that you never had to pay for. Or to the extent that this happens 15 years from now, you'd have less period of time remaining in the 50-year contract that you wouldn't have bought, because it'd be uncertain as to when this expansion might occur. Or you may choose to buy the project out in year 8, in which case you wish you'd never written the check.
Or they walk away yourself.
The project failed. So it seems like a lot of guesswork in trying to figure out what the math would be.
That is probably a comment.
Yeah, I think it would be.
Well, the pro of this would be that you could actually maybe pay them off cheaper and go build the road we really needed.
Yeah, it's not the one we didn't.
Yeah.
Having paid for the one that we didn't need, we
Yeah.
can pay for the one that we needed.
This might be the best option we got of the whole thing. Go ahead and have your toll road, and we'll go build another road, decided it should have been built. So, that might be the pro.
But if we build another road outside of the corridor, what I just heard is, it doesn't apply. Right, so there is no non-compete. So really, the biggest con of this is, how are you gonna do this over the causeway? Right, I mean, this is like, it's an impractical solution. You can't, widening it over the causeways is, an act of Congress, just about, so you get no widening over the causeways. And then the second con of it is, the DOT has already kind of gone through this analysis, and they decided that, it was, let me explain, there was a project in CRTPO's, TIP, that had adding a general purpose lane from exit 28 to 36. And the DOT in their negotiations with the developer said, you know what, it's just cheaper if we go ahead and add that back into the non-compete. So you kind of already made that calculation, that it was better to not pursue this option by the fact that you've added that project back into the non-compete. If that makes any sense. I'm getting a bunch of blank stares.
When you say non-compete, that's where you lost me. I mean, the fact that
It's
it's
a
already in there, that we can
So
build a
check-
line from
So,
20 to
so the
36.
non-compete does not apply to any project that's in a transportation plan at the time the contract was adopted, right? So CRTPO said, okay, just as a placeholder, we're gonna put a project in from exit 28 to 36, general purpose lanes. And in the course of the contract negotiations, the department said, okay, and I'm not privy obviously to those negotiations, the department said, okay, you know what, it's, whatever they were asking, because that was in there and that potential threat to the revenue, they said, we're gonna put that back into the non-compete. So even though it was in a plan, the non-compete still applies to that project. So that project was specifically included in the non-compete. So they've already made kind of the calculation that, you know what, trying to buy out this exact option where we have a placeholder for us to add a general purpose lane isn't worth it. That was part of the contract negotiation. Did you get all that?
Tell me if there's, as I said, tell me what I need to add then to what's up here to reflect that. So right now-
Already considered in contract negotiations.
Anything else, either questions that you have based on what's been discussed or thoughts about either an advantage or disadvantage that hasn't yet? I've got the pros that could be lower risk to purchase this, in present dollars versus future dollars, lower uncertainty for planning purposes. Cons are that, that as it says that DOT can't build more general purpose lanes without contractor approval. That it assumes the value will go up in the future, may not, there's a lot of uncertainties in terms of assessing that risk. If it can't be widened over the causeway, that would be a limited benefit, and it's already been considered in contract negotiations. Okay, ready to go on to the next one, which is D, option D.
Okay. Option D actually goes to specific to what some of the options we are talking about. Potentially adding, extending 21, somebody mentioned 77 bypass, so projects like that. So with this option, I-77 would continue, the project would continue as being planned, but local municipalities would work with CRTPO and start identifying some of those projects so that those projects could be advanced to address mobility issues in the corridor. This option also includes not just projects like we mentioned, like 21 extension or the potential bypass. It also includes other elements, improvement that could be made along I-77 that are still allowed without really requiring a revenue impact, such as changing the using the shoulders during certain times of the day, or ITS equipment installation, or other small improvements that could be made that could still improve traffic operations on I-77. So that is the scope of this option, or some of the elements of the scope of this option. In terms of cost impacts, this option would not really have a cost impact unless we take this back to option C5, which is adding lanes, a main line along I-77. Going to the scope and funding, again, this is any improvements you're looking at are not necessarily part of I-77. Those are individual, independent projects, so nothing really needs to be advanced in terms of approvals for I-77 to carry on. That means I-77 construction would go on. It would not, this option would not require stopping construction for I-77. And similar to C5, depending on the improvements you identify, additional studies would need to be performed. I already mentioned the last bullet, but I'm kind of going to repeat it again. However, if those improvements meet the definition of the unplanned revenue impacting facilities, which is again going back to C5, we need to kind of go back and look at the cost impact. But that's not necessarily the intent of this option. This option is to look at improvements that are not revenue impacting facilities.
Well, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
That almost begs the question then that if it doesn't impact their revenue, then it would not have any significant impact on what's happening in the general purpose lane. If the reason you're using a toll lane is to get out of congestion or to have a guaranteed time, to say that anything you do here won't impact that is essentially saying anything you do here won't help those who aren't using the toll. So when you talk about, for example, hardening of shoulders, I assume that that was the one that when you get to the additional improvements, that could, and they would probably argue, would be a revenue impact if all of a sudden that is essentially giving greater general purpose capacity that's not in the toll line. Is that a fair assumption that they would probably make that argument?
You want to chime
I
in,
don't
or?
think so, and you have to recognize there's limited entrance to the facilities, but that would be part of the consideration. They needed to be cautious to say this isn't a blank check, you can do anything, but facilitating movement between two interchanges is not the market they're after. And so it's a consideration, but it's not it. I just want to point out too, these are not DOT proposals, these are straight from public comments. And so, you know, any option with CRTPO in the title, I knew was gonna have a hard time.
That was a con of the first three letters, right?
But
The
only reason it's up here is we got a number of comments and we put some in the report and the addendum where people said, I-77 isn't my biggest issue, I want you to focus on this or focus on that. Now, some of those people thought that all local improvements were prohibited and that's why they were concerned, but others just, you know, wanted somebody to take up other projects here. So you point out a good thing, some things that might help only a small group, but those are the people who wrote in and took the time and said, I need help in this little part of the Lake Norman area.
Well, go ahead, Sister.
And I would look at this option, just like Jim said, I think this captured a lot of different comments, so it's everything from, you know, can you do things as small as add parking rides for CAT's express bus service to improving 21, you know, and a new crossing. I mean, it's everything, so it could be really broad, it could be from really small to really big. So there's a lot of things in here that you could, you know, really focus on.
Well, I think that dovetails in with my thought, and that is our process here, and I'm not questioning the process necessarily, but it's like we are looking at these situations from your report a while back, which I highly respect. However, it is also keeping us from being creative. And what I'm saying is, yeah, you know, one of the creative ideas is hardening the shoulder. And if we harden the shoulder, what impact, and let's face it, a lot of our problem, and we talked about the last meeting, a lot of our problem, we solved the wrong problem. We solved Charlotte people being able to get to Lake Norman. Where if you ask a Lake Norman person, they said the problem is between exit 23 and 26, and we're limited on what we do across the lake, so really our ability impact is exit 23 to 28. Well, from 23 to 28, hardening the shoulder might be a really viable option that we should probably look at and break out separately. And I guess my point is I would wish we, this committee would be more creative going, all right, what could we do outside the box? And it would be all the stuff in D that we have not subsetted yet.
Well, and if I can just, I think it may have been a while since we talked about this, which I think is a good point, but I think earlier on, we've kind of gotten into this analysis of these options, but I think the original charge to this group absolutely involves saying, and help us think of other things that we may not have talked about yet. So I want to, if you're feeling like, wow, we're really being limited in what we're even able to throw out there. I think that is not the intent of this, so,
Right.
so
Well-
let's see if we can make a, would it be okay if we get through the rest of these options and
good
come
with
back to
that.
that? Because
Yeah.
I think that there would be time even today to do that, unless there's a lot more discussion that I'm anticipating in these other ones, but I think that's actually something specifically that was asked for us to say, help us think about other options. So I'm gonna parking lot that and come back to it.
Fine, thank you.
And,
Anything else on this option?
yeah, so there's more, we haven't talked too much about I captured the one con that I heard about, it does mean going back to CRTPO, which was something that was talked about with some earlier options as well as being a downside. Other things that you think this would give you in terms of advantages or disadvantages?
It just seems, to me, it just seems very general.
Yep.
To try and weigh in a pro and a con on a very general comment at the high level.
I think it's almost like a parking lot, maybe come back and like you were saying, have just a little bit of a brainstorming session for 10 or 15 minutes or something. Throw some things up there. I mean, yeah, the con is that it's ambiguous and uncertain, so.
Okay, so let's come back to brainstorm ideas for this one, okay?
To me, D is where you go when all else has failed and you're tweaking around the edges. I mean, that just, and it's, so kind of to John's point, to your point is, yeah, this is the catch-all for the moment as defined, but we haven't defined everything, so thanks.
Okay.
You ready to go to E? Down to the last two. E is the one that basically you initiate or start developing preliminary plans to identify financing and start negotiation to purchase the express lanes project after the completion. So that means the construction would go on, the facility would open, and the developer would complete the construction, would maintain the facility during that time, and NCDOT would look into options to purchase and finance the project. And once those are defined and figured out, the project would be purchased by NCDOT. With this option, the new lanes being built will remain core, but state would operate the facility. If you remember, this is kind of similar to option A, except option A is like purchase today, start construction, purchase today, and state take over, whereas this one is complete everything and then state come in and take over. So the timing of this is a little bit uncertain. It depends on when the negotiations and the funding is obtained. Talking about funding and with respect to cost impacts, you probably remember many options we looked at last week, option A, B, and C1. We looked at cost impacts, cost to complete, as well as termination costs. In this one, the project is complete with this scenario, so you're really looking at termination costs, which is basically between senior debt and fair market value. That's where I would like to request Jim to come in and continue from here, from the next couple of slides. Or I can give you this, it doesn't matter.
Yes, do that. And then just a comment on why I'm doing this and I didn't speak on any of the other options. It started with me being volunteered after Phil had another commitment. But then after thinking about it, this is a good place for me to come in because one of our priorities was always to get to you guys talking among yourselves as quickly as possible. But these next two options are the most complicated. And so what I'd like to do in order to make it more efficient is strongly encourage you, if you have any questions, if there's a term you're not familiar with, let's talk about that now so that all of you can participate in the subsequent discussion. This is the one where people feel intimidated if they don't understand anything. But here we have an opportunity, which is exactly what this advisory committee was for, to go through it. When we first started the Mercator report, we got, yes, Mr. Puckett?
It's, we had discussed at some point whether we would go in closed session when we start to make some assumptions on cost to get out. I noticed you printed some stuff, which is okay, but I don't know if at some point we will be discussing things that if we were into I don't know if this is a negotiated piece or if this is cut and dry.
If I could give you my 2 cents on that. I understand the concern about Centra watching this video or maybe being in the audience. I am a resource for you guys, and I'm providing examples. I haven't done an appraisal, and I'm going to explain to you what an appraisal involves. I think we as a group can talk about strategy, and I can give you my thoughts. DOT has not accepted my report. They have not signed off on it. They have not said any of the numbers that we're talking about bind them in any way. They can pay much less than I'm giving you as an example. So I think there is some benefit to having this public discussion, and I hope you guys don't hold back because you think it undermines negotiations, because I'm not representing DOT.
I think I may be holding back because it undermines negotiations.
What?
There's some things that we'll get into here in a moment that we might want to consider, to your point, Commissioner, a negotiating strategy. So let's to Jim's point, Jim Taylor's point, let's go through and see how far we get, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's 2 stages. One is I need to give everyone enough knowledge so that all of us are equally dangerous here around the table. And the second stage is the brainstorming and figuring out what the advisory group needs to look through to go on.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
When I was first retained, we got a lot of public comments all throughout the process, and people were all over the place in terms of their confidence in the numbers that have been thrown out about what the cost to terminate was. And a number of people submitted some very creative ideas of how to negotiate and how to get out of this. So for purposes of the Mercator report, which you were giving on the first day, I thought it was important to provide an appendix that provided an example of how this takes place. This isn't a jump ball where everything is subject to negotiation. There's a whole appendix to the agreement that talks about it. And so one of the things that I think is important for you guys to consider is that the agreement provides special protections for the lenders, the debt. That is separate from what the equity, the guys from Spain and their co-equity investors get. And so what you see up here is that in order to terminate, you have to calculate how much it would take to pay off the debt and compare that to the fair market value of the entire facility. In this case, the debt is composed of 2 parties. One are investors who purchase tax-exempt bonds, 100 million of tax-exempt bonds. They are exempt from U.S. taxes, so they're mostly institutions in the U.S. that can take advantage of that benefit. The rates range from 3%, they're under 5% on that. The other is the United States Department of Transportation. That is the TIFIA loan. You'll see that acronym, TIFIA a lot. That's a loan provided by the U.S. government to this project. It has about a 3% rate. Both of these debt instruments are very long-term. They're expecting to be paid back over 20 to 40 years. And because their rates are low and they're patient and they're flexible, they get special priority in a termination. We're talking about a termination for convenience here, but there's other default terminations and things like that. So just understand that first we see how much the debt gets paid because they have a special priority in most situations. Yes?
What is the plan, what is the plan senior debt at completion for those 2 pieces? Did you say 100 million for the first one?
100 for the first one, 189 for the second, and that's where I'm going, is to completion, and show you those 2 numbers. The other is the fair market value. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, before we go, I just want to add one thing. Actually, you all received copies of this at the previous meeting because we brought all these slides. But starting at this slide, there are some minor text revisions. and compared to what you received last week. So the slides that you have now include the revisions. But just to be clear and transparent, each time that Jim goes to a slide, you will see some text in yellow. That is basically all that has been added to this. And you will see that, and if you click next time, Jim, that highlight will go away. But it's really just to let you know that yes, we made changes, but they're very minor. Thank you.
And in the Mercator report, which you have, there's an appendix that lists all the adjustments and additions. We're talking high level here, but there are more complex things going on, so that's why that footnote was added about there's other allowable costs, and those details are in the Mercator report in that appendix. This is from the Mercator report. It was described as an illustrative example. It is not an appraisal, and it is not a max and a min. You're looking for it in your report, or are you looking on the slide? You got it? What we decided to do for the report is use information that was public. As part of our report, we didn't interview Centro, we didn't get inside information or anything. We only used what was public so that people could follow along. This first row here is scenario A, an example where we pulled the publicly available information about what the equity thought might be the revenue here.
So, to be clear, because you look at equity participants, advisors, projection of traffic and revenue, those are the CNN numbers, right?
That's correct.
So just for shorthand, that's saying calculation with Centra's numbers.
Well, actually, what we're going to see is C is probably Centra's numbers. But these are publicly available numbers. They're in the report. They're in the offering statement. It was a decision to say, well, what can we start with that everybody can look at?
Okay. So what is A if that's not, those are the CNN numbers.
Right. CNN often provides a base case and then an equity-based case. The equity-based case is much higher than the base. And that's why we did a C where we said, well, what happens if it's 150% of that?
You said no dumb question, CNM.
Oh, sorry. CNM is the acronym for the traffic consultant that worked for Centro on this. And they prepared a report that was made public to the investors. And then the investors had their own consultants review that report and test it. But what I want to show you here is that the appraiser will have to say, when you terminate this, they're giving up some revenue stream. And so this is just for starters. It's not the final determination. The appraiser actually would say, this is from 2014. I'm not going to start with this. I'll go look at something else. But for purposes of an example, we started with this example. And the appraiser has to say, how much would somebody pay for this revenue stream? Well, is the revenue stream guaranteed? No, there's some risk that that revenue will come. So what would be a comparable return for a investment with a comparable risk? Arbitrarily, I said 11%. You discount the revenue back, you say, what's the value of that revenue stream today at 11%? You come up with a number. What this table does in the column that says fair market value, the way the process worked in order to protect the taxpayers in the state, you subtract from the value the cost to complete. So you end up with a number that's much lower here than the value of the project. You compare this is back at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. This is the example in the report, not new information. In this scenario, the debt would get paid and the equity would not get
So
any.
this isn't really scenario E.
No, it's not. I'm sorry, what's your question?
This is not option E.
No, it's not. We're getting to option. This is, one of the things we want to do is say, we're not changing the process
Right,
from the report.
because before it's completed, you're including the cost of, that would be required to achieve substantial.
Exactly. So this is what was in the report, and then what we did is to show an example. If you assume that revenue projection was too aggressive, you cut it in half, then the likely return that somebody wants from a lower projection, you discount it at a lower rate, but when you subtract the cost to complete, that ended up being a negative number. And then you look the other way. Suppose the revenues actually are 50% higher. Well, then that's an even riskier one. The return is higher and you come. These are the numbers for completion or termination during construction. We use the exact same process to say what happens after you're complete. Arbitrarily chose January 2019. There may still be construction going on after that, but we just wanted to pick a point in the future. That's the only thing that changed. That's the whole point of me going through the other example. We kept the placeholder revenue streams. We kept the same discount rates for the example. The thing that moved now is the purchaser doesn't have to wait a couple of years to get that revenue, and the purchaser doesn't have to invest any more to complete.
And the debt.
I'm sorry?
And the debt. You have all the debt loaded.
Yes, and have the debt. And so in this situation, the debt went up. It's the same in each scenario because you just pay that off, but the value goes higher. And so what this is saying is that if you had that revenue stream in scenario A, and the appraiser went out and said, how much would somebody pay me for this revenue stream? If the market return was 11%, it would be that $555 million. You can't see that. Okay. And then all we did was the same stress test, 50% higher, 50% lower. This is not binding. This is not sharing anything. If you go to termination, the department would try to hire a consultant who would argue the revenues that they assumed were too high, and the discount rate should be higher because it was much riskier.
Here's my concern.
Yeah.
Because you got media in the room, and so now the narrative that's out there is, okay, so the cost for it to buy out the contract is somewhere between $392 million and $623 million.
And I was just going to say, I would encourage the media that you would be very irresponsible to use any of these numbers in any of your
So to Jim's earlier
messages.
point then, this is an illustrative example from publicly available numbers.
Right, and Mr. Noss is right on point. If we go back to the prior chart here, I felt that in the report and in the appendix, I put everything. This is an example, this is a range.
Doesn't matter.
The press came out, 300 million is what the cost is complete, and guess what the responses we got from the community? Half of them said, this is a bargain, only 300 million, let's go for it. The other half said, 300 million, are you crazy? Can you imagine what we would do with that? And so one of the things I think you should consider is, does the number really matter? From looking at all of the hundreds of comments I got, it appeared that people had a position that was not reflective of the number. And I think you guys can have a productive conversation, because I have not found anybody who said, I'd be for it if it was less than X, but if it's more than Y, then I'm against. You're either for it or against it. And so these are a range for you to talk about the realm of possibility, whether or not you want to be creative in where you find it. But these are just examples, and the key takeaway for you is to understand that it's an independent person who's going to say, what could the revenue be based upon this debt, where we are now. These were all hypothetical, so you have to use studies. What has happened in other parts of the country is the buyout has taken place after there's been some operating history, and that makes it less of dueling consultants and more based upon actual experience. And so then you say, the appraiser says, based upon this, this is what I think the value of your asset is.
Yeah, if I could add, one thing that you're not talking about is trust. And when you talk about the people say this, they for this or that, but if the people have more trust in the process, I mean, the people up here in North Mecklenburg have not had trust in DOT, with all due respect. They have not had trust. So it's the same process when our district attorney says, because people don't trust the police, the juries don't convict, even if they give all this great evidence, because they have trust issues and they doubt things. So I'm just, as you mentioned this, I think it's important that you keep that in mind as well, that there's a trust factor, and the people, you know, they don't trust the numbers because they don't trust the DOT because of what they have seen, what they have endured, what they continue to endure, and so, but I think that has to be brought up.
No,
as part of
I
it.
think-
You can't just talk about it's this or that. No, it's also this overarching problem where the people here are frustrated and they don't trust, and it's thinks everybody's lying.
No, and Ms. Coughlin, that's where we started in April of last year. And I got people who felt very strongly, this can be done for $0. And they felt it strongly. Others strongly felt 800 million, that's what it's gonna cost. They wouldn't have lied to us. Now you have a little bit more transparency. The numbers that were used here are in your packet. You can look at them and say, well, I don't believe this, or I wanna use a different rate. But we're trying to gain back some of that trust through this transparency about where do these numbers come from, what's the process. The other thing is, got a ton of comments saying, Mercator's report is a waste of time, it's just gonna sit on a shelf. You now have an advisory committee. You don't gain trust back overnight, but each of these are steps that go forward.
Right.
And so hopefully,
But we
despite
can-
what the
but
press
But
says,
we need to continue to talk about this. I mean, we haven't
Yeah.
talked about it, and it seems like I bring it up every meeting, but we have to continue to talk about it, because that's what's happening at kitchen tables in North Mecklenburg, when they're saying, I don't trust these people. And I mean, I'm already hearing comments when people ask me about the committee, and I'm like, we're making progress, you know, they're at least, you know, they're trying, and I give credit to Governor Cooper for this and everybody who's worked on it, but they're still, you know, well, it probably ain't gonna work. It's probably, we're stuck, we're screwed. That, you know, that is still out there, so I just don't like it that I'm bringing it up. I would like you to bring it up, because I think it's real.
And fair bet, and I don't disagree with you in anything you just said. I will say that this committee is an excellent example of, we're getting to the point of the transparency of it, right? Option B, people complain, oh, this committee's not, I say, well, here's option B, is DOT takes all these numbers and makes decisions in Rockland, right? So the fact that we're at the table having some discussions and we have some transparency.
And we
this
also
is-
have excellent representation
From DOT.
consistently.
Yes,
that's right.
and that has a lot of value. I can't tell you how much value that has in our eyes, and we appreciate Mr. Secretary being here. But in all those guys, and I guess I would dovetail off of that, Pat, and I understand that, is, Mr. Secretary, have we started, and I know you might not be able to publicly, have we started looking at from the appraisal process? Because as he said, we're gonna need an appraisal, and we're gonna have to make some decisions, but we're gonna make some decisions. It's like, are you gonna buy or sell a house, but I wanna do it before I have an appraisal.
No, we have not started any appraisal process. Right now, we're working off of, as Jim said, these are planning numbers, and that's why I think it's important that we get through all of these alternatives and then give the group time to go back and say, is there anything we missed that didn't fit into these categories, or it may fit in this broad category? And then there was another proposal, can we do some scoring of some of these? I think we need to take all the ones with all the options and look at hypothetical scoring. I really love Jim's explanation on what you just heard, because I'll explain it a little more simply, but because this is an even more complex example, but it's almost like acquiring 5 parcels of right-of-way from different owners. We at DOT have our appraisals, and we go in there, but the ultimate value, you know, that number is an estimate for us to start with, but it will never determine the ultimate value of that property. There's a more complex process that goes on. Well, this is even more complex than that. So that's why this is a range of numbers. So when we even start looking at alternatives to score, we'll probably start with a range of numbers and say, okay, if they're in this range, you know, this may work. If it's outside of this range, then it'll be very difficult.
And my concern is we're putting up here, this is the range, and I don't think that
But
this is the range.
it's a planning, I would just say it's a kind of a planning ballpark order of magnitude.
And the other piece that we did by putting in the press, right, and I'm not gonna fault you two, because I don't know, or others who might be behind me, that we're giving them the narrative to go, here's what it is, and they did somewhat try to say, to start the opinion and create the opinion, it's 300 million. Well, that's as much a swag as we all know in this room, but yet didn't stop them from going out and start using those numbers.
right, and so one of the reasons why you guys are around this table committing all this time is you're not just reading the headlines. You've been reading the reports, answering questions, And so at some point, this is not a public referendum. This is you guys making decisions about where you stand. And one question is, does the number matter to you? If it's 500 versus 300, does that change your opinion? Is there more information you need to know? Do any of you still believe it could be 0? That's what we're here for, is not to sway the public, but to give you the information so that you feel comfortable. So we want to get to you talking among each other, but I want to make sure that we haven't been using terms, and before people start strategizing about different ways to do this, do you understand the basics of where these numbers come up and what the appraiser has to do that DOT can't? I mean, the analogy of the right-of-way is perfect, you know?
And I'll stop after this, because I don't want to control. But Jim, you put up a number, say the 392 or the 555. Is it fair then to add what DOT, the seed money of 92 million that we already put in, and then this is what we would be buying the entire contract for? I'm trying to equate equity in our cost.
Yeah, normally you wouldn't include the sunk costs in the cost to everybody.
It's the same as like buying a business, right? What somebody paid in the past for a business has no bearing on what you're gonna pay for. You're gonna base it on
I
how
understand,
much
but
money you're
if
gonna
we
make.
want to say this is a $655 million project, which is the baseline we used at the
Right,
beginning.
right.
The NCDOT has now put in 92 million, or whatever the initial costs were, and now we're adding 392 to that. Are we getting the 600, I mean, I know that's a bad example, but are we getting that amount? Is that the whole number of actual cost of
Can I
DOT?
just- Real quick.
Regardless, I would,
So there's a big difference, and correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, between before the project is completed and after it's completed, right? After it's completed, greater fair market value or senior outstanding debt, all right? So all this, as Mr. Taylor just said, sunk cost. So whether we put in 20 million or $200 million, sunk cost. What you care about, somebody's gonna look at, it's the fair market value based on the developer's interest, which means how much the contract is worth, and they're gonna look at how much money they can make, and that's the long and the short.
I guess I'm taking a step further. What do we have to sell to the legislatures, right? At some point, we're gonna have to be selling to the legislatures, and if you go and saying, hey, it's gonna be 655 or whatever the number, and here's what we got, right? And having the value of what we got.
And what you could say is a floor, because you gotta bail out the bondholder, right? So a floor on this is gonna be 289.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so your best case scenario, you could say, it's a 600, the cost, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, cost $655 million, and depending upon what we use as input for the fair market value, if it's less than that, but, you know, we have to make the bondholders whole for $289 million.
Yeah, let me just suggest before we get into how do we sell this, that I want to make sure everybody, we go through this exercise of the pros and cons. I think that that's useful,
That's fair.
and we have one more option to do as well. So,
One thing, I mean, it's a bad project with another ominously bad contract hooked to it. So the only hope I see in this is that you have to let it complete itself, open it up, hope it doesn't do very well, and then be able to work your way out of that mess by using that as your leverage. Because right now, we have no leverage. This is like walking into a car dealership and saying, I got $100,000 and I want to buy your cheapest car you got.
just to help your brainstorming, the other option is it opens up, it does very well, and you can buy it using the toll revenues to buy it out. That you don't have to come up with taxpayer money, that it's strong enough that as a publicly owned thing, you finance it itself.
Who would finance that?
You already have a turnpike authority, or you could create a new entity if you wanted.
I think it's 95 up in Richmond. It was a toll road for a long time, and they paid it off, and now it's not.
No, it's not, yep.
Yes, and there's been some that have flipped from public to private ownership. I mean, these are assets and businesses that go both ways, but where you guys have to come in is, what are your public policy goals that should govern no matter what option is there? What are we trying to achieve that, you know, it goes beyond just no tolls? You want mobility, you want to address some of the problems in the area so that that's your ultimate end. Not just, you don't focus on the means, focus on what the end is that you want. So let's go to Peg and then,
Sorry, before we go there, I don't know how important it is, but we have slide basically talking about the approvals, and that's kind of a critical element in terms of schedule for this is, at this point, sorry.
Well, I just
go ahead,
want,
sir.
this is
these costs are to buy out Central.
Terminate the contract, yes.
But assuming you do the 1119, there's 40 some odd years left of the contract, in which Central bears a lot of costs of the roadway, including the condition of the roadway at the end of the contract.
Right.
So wouldn't those need to be considered?
They are in
Discount.
here. And so the appraiser will look at not only the revenue that's generated, but the likely operating costs and the maintenance and renewal costs as well.
So that's in these numbers.
So that's another reason why we used what was public, so that if somebody wanted to go through and see what the assumptions were, those are in there.
But it's net of like handback reserves, for instance.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
so Mr. Kern's point, I think that's already, you've already baked that into
Exactly.
this particular example.
Yeah, that was his question. It wasn't included, and that's in here.
Because they have to set aside, they have to deposit certain funds to make sure that at the end of the contract, the place, it's not a wreck when.
Right, so that shouldn't be counted as profit to them that they get reimbursed for.
Right.
That's a cost that
Right.
gets netted out.
Okay, so Rhonda has a bit more information on approvals and schedule impacts, and then we're going to ask you to look at the pros and cons for this action.
Yeah, well, approvals is pretty straightforward. Project is complete at that point, so you don't really need any approval, but the big thing is the funding, going through the SDI project prioritization and understanding when you could potentially get the funding. And I know we talked at length about this at the last meeting, but just to remind you, the next prioritization would happen between 19 and 21. That is 2019 and 2021. I don't want to get confused with the exit numbers, but 2019 and 2021. And depending on how the project performs in competition with all other statewide projects, the project could possibly get funded in the next TIP, which is FY22 to do FY31. And I don't think there's really anything on this slide that you haven't already talked about, but in terms of specific when this transition happens, it all depends on when the decisions are made and when the monies are available to take the action.
Could I
Yes, sir.
make a comment? One of the things I want to consider is at least the possibility that this particular project could be considered outside of STI. And I understand STI is the way we do it now, but there rises to the occasion all the time in government the anomaly that works outside of the plan. And I think this is the case. And as a matter of fact, I would argue the case that since this project was not part of STI, this was the last project under the old system, to then somehow, well, yeah, you should make the argument you could grandfather that you worked outside of STI because it came in outside of STI. And that's certainly what I'm talking to with folks in Raleigh and legislature and saying, you know, legal, fair, consistent. You can't really take the folks in North Mecklenburg and go, hey, we held your project off until the very last project after STI, and now we're gonna throw you at the bottom of the list because now you're gonna roll into STI. It's kind of the worst of all scenarios. So I appreciate that is the way it is, but I wouldn't want anybody to say that is the law of the land and there's no option to change that, because the folks who made STI the law can make a variance and a variance to that law. So anyone reporting that, I wouldn't take that as an absolute given that that's the only funding opportunity.
Thanks for the comment.
I guess I have several questions, and I think if you would leave out of this room and you were not sitting here, the first thing I would say is that it's a large price tag. And my question would be, where would the funds come from? When would they be available, and how would it affect the bonus allocation?
Several parts of that. Part of that is what Mr. Puckett was just addressing, that you either go through STI or your grandfather can come up with a different process to go through the state and get the funding for that. So I think that that's not an answer anybody can answer definitively.
Can you elaborate on what that would mean? Is that a legislative decision, whether it goes in or out of the STI? How would,
Well, the default now is it has to go through STI.
Right, but if there's an extraordinary anomaly, which we're gonna assume we are grandfathered and we're extraordinary, what's the process to avoid STI?
The only statutory authority that stays out of STI today is any grants. So for example, if we submit it for a federal infra grant, or a Tiger grant, Tiger's usually small, infra's larger, those monies aren't constrained under the STI process. They're outside of the STI process.
Federal grants.
Yes.
All federal grants are constrained outside?
They're all not constrained by the STI process. So it's treated as outside money that doesn't have to go through prioritization, as long as the project is selected in the grants process.
The future, toll road projects, are they included in the STI?
Yes, sir.
Even though they're revenue producing, but
Yes,
you're
Yes,
not
sir.
using?
And I can explain that is because each of them are evaluated based on their benefits, and costs is one of the criteria. And so the cost is only the cost to the highway trust fund. So anything that's paid for by the toll revenue is a reduction in cost, which then makes its score higher and its points higher.
So if we got federal grant money to make this project work the way we want it to, it would not fall in STI for that fact then, is that what you're saying, or?
It would still fall under STI for anything not covered by the federal grant. So a great example would be, we have a project that's grade separation that was $33 million. It scored, it was programmed, but now it got a $20 million federal Tiger grant. So that $20 million comes out. So as far as the STI process is concerned, that project only cost $13 million. The $20 million now is off those books.
Did that make the STI number go up because of that?
Yes.
So if we can keep this under 1.3 trillion, we can do something?
What about,
No comment.
I mean, can the state negotiate outside funding through private bonds and
You
through
still
the
have
private
to pay
sector?
that still is payback, and so we have to pay it back through funds available through STI.
Yeah, but we'd cash flow it through our toll, so couldn't we manage that without having the STI involved?
It would score, it would move it up, the score of STI.
Yeah, but we don't have one that pays for itself completely.
But, you know, it's a great
Yeah.
question, because when we think about
Yeah.
public-private partnerships, and depending on where you sit in the room, you may prefer to do more of these in the future, depending on what it might advance for the state. But the ability to weigh when is an appropriate time to buy out a contract is something we should be looking at on an ongoing basis, right? It's not, and whether that fits within STI or whether it's just the best use of the public's money, is something that we ought to be talking about with the legislature, because it's just the right thing. You know, there might be an inflection point where the project's doing poorly, or it's doing exceedingly well, where it can self-finance itself. It just makes better sense to take the public-private party out on fair terms, based on the terms of the contract.
In fact,
So,
question.
Mr. Kern, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we totally debunked the questions that she started with, so I apologize, I'll redirect the questions.
I think we addressed where does money come from. The bonus allocation, there was a response earlier today.
Yeah.
Do somebody want to talk to that?
Carly?
That's the response that we gave
Oh,
to the group.
the,
So we emailed a little bit of information about bonus allocations last night.
Yeah, so essentially with bonus allocation, you know, with any of the options that, at any point, if the tolling were to change on this, the bonus allocation dollars are determined by the amount of toll revenue, the amount of debt on that toll revenue that's issued, according to the tracking revenue report on it. If that were to change, yes, it would change the bonus allocation, that's the source of funds for that. Essentially, you know, the cost associated with the bonus allocation projects would be then tied to whatever project was advancing in STI that was changing the tolling, right? So whatever project's proposed, and then whatever projects are not under construction would simply stop and sort of await the process.
So where does it say that if we were to cancel this, we'd have to return that bonus allocation? Is that an STI?
It basically says that the project is eligible for bonus allocation based on its tolling, and it gives the measures. So if you lose that eligibility, then you lose the exemption.
I think the law says, upon authorization to construct a project financed through toll revenues, the department shall make available, blah, 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 blah.
Say that again.
What
It
if the
says,
project fails?
upon authorization to construct a project financed through toll revenues.
So once it's determined, it's yours.
It doesn't say, well, what it doesn't say is upon completion of construction, or even when you're in construction, it just says upon authorization.
Or if the project is changed halfway through, it doesn't address that either.
It just says upon authorization, and then I couldn't find anything where it says anything about returning. It just says, if you're authorized, you get your allocation, and it's gotta be used within the next 5 years.
I think there's a good example of where the community of North Mecklenburg would be hyper, critical or hypersensitive going, what's the research behind that email response? So if Kirk.
And we can provide you the statute and do all of that, but you know, and this is more of a question for DOT than certainly for the Turnpike, but you know, I think it raises some, I think you may run some future public trust issues if you, I think if you start scoring projects,
And then withdraw.
planning them and then withdrawing them and spending, you know, taxpayer money on bonus allocation projects where there is no tolling there.
But in this, and I found it for those of you who are interested, chapter 136, article 14B, subparagraph E3. Funds obtained through highway tolling. Upon authorization to construct a project with funding from toll revenue, the department shall make available for allocation amount equal to 1/2 of the project construction cost derived from toll revenue bonds. The bonds have been issued. The bonds have been spent on a project that's supposed to derive revenue from tolls. We've comported with the law. So why are we returning the bonus allocation? Where did all this come from?
And what tells us we have to?
Further to the point, what if our grandchildren decide in the year 2050 they want to cancel the contract? Would they have to return the bonus allocation?
The question was asked was, if you terminate now, what happens to does the bonus allocation dollars stop? What happens to those? And that's the answer. Now, what happens in 2025 or, I mean, you know, 2040? That is, you know, that's something we have to go back and think
Repeat
about.
the answer again, Bo, of what happens if we stop now? I'd like you to repeat that answer.
So essentially, if you stop now, assuming this is assumed you're going to take forward another STI project, right? Something you're going to replace this project with something else. The cost of the cost of the completed or under construction bonus allocation projects would essentially be added to the cost of the project being scored through STI and would be sort of paid back through that channel, through the STI channel. Any projects that are not under construction would simply just not go forward.
Could you give us the line and verse of the statute that says that?
I don't
Not
think-
today, but I'm saying come back to us.
Yeah, we can take that as an action item, because
Yeah.
again, I'm just reading.
We're reading the statute, it says one thing, and you're quoting something else, we just would like to reconcile that.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so we'll add that to the list of information items coming back.
And at
with
some
the-
point, the
with the
interpretation
language
needs to be
of-
do the right thing, whether it's the law or the contract or the statute. There's a do the right thing trust application that Commissioner Coffin spoke to. Again, if you bait and switch effectively North Mecklenburg on bonus allocation projects, particularly coming out of the town of Davidson right now, who's gotten not much. We've gotten some roads, but our population has grown exponentially, as everyone else has had, and the state funding and the NCDOT funding that we've received, we've gotten no new roads, but we've got a mess of an exit, I mean, a mess of a bridge now that we can't get on or off throughout the day. So you can't, and Davidson's a small part, I appreciate that, but it's a part. Nonetheless, you can't take back these projects that have been committed and agreed upon. I don't know how we end up with the funding in the SDI, but again, I would like to answer legally the documentation as to the SDI funding and how it goes back into play.
Bonus allocation.
Thank you.
Y'all say last week that the senior debt's not assumable.
No, it can, you can't force them to give it to you, but you could say, you could negotiate with them, and that.
To take the
Right, and
Spanish
that has
company out
happened.
of the scenario.
Right, and that has happened before. If you're gonna toll it still, their first priority, they have the deal set, so that could be one way to
Negotiate it through. And that wouldn't impact us on the STI either, would it?
You would still have the toll revenue gap.
That we would use.
Yeah, but I'm talking about going back to go through STI.
If there's any
approval.
costs above and beyond assuming the debt, then that's new money that has to go through
And would
STI.
leave the side money alone too, 330-some million that's for projects up and down
The bonus allocation, you have a list of that in your
Yeah.
packet today.
so
bonus
it wouldn't
allocation.
impact that either.
But I think it's correct, there needs to be a lawyer to do that, because that goes to what was the intent when the legislature
And-
set up the bonus
And the
allocation.
corollary of that would be, how does that change if we reduce the amount of lanes tolled, i.e. if we say we're gonna run one from 28 to Charlotte and not two from 28
Because
to
there's
Charlotte?
nothing in the law about the capital structure. I was looking at this obviously after the last meeting, and I can't find anything. All it says is you get it authorized, you get your bonus allocation.
So as long as we can keep a toll lane in place, maybe not the entire extent of the toll lane, but a toll lane somewhere.
And then this whole thing about,
It's the ratio of the toll revenue, as far as the capital costs, up to 50% of the capital costs paid for by toll revenue. So if that percentage goes down, the amount will go down.
Now, you guys are chomping at the bit to talk about strategy,
Yeah.
but I still think
Yeah,
we should.
I wanna check in, because it's 2:45. Our original goal was to try to get through pros and cons on E and F still today. And one of the things we've identified in for meeting 6, as well as going over the evaluation matrix, is a chance for you to brainstorm ways to identify and address additional improvements, to advance some of the mobility issues in the corridor. So, and I know a lot of your questions have been about this, what it means to purchase these after completion. But yeah, if we could step back from the strategy for a bit, one of the things I heard from you, Mr. Kerr, and it's all like a pro, is that I think this option we do is something that should be done regularly anyway, which is give it an opportunity to say when does it make sense to buy out a contract? Is that fair to put that in the pro?
Legislative act to do. You're exactly right.
Not just this one, any one, you should have the ability at some point to go.
Should be regular.
It's like leasing a car and you go, you know what, at this point, I think I'll buy the lease.
That's correct.
It just makes more sense.
If you're 30,000 miles over your.
Yeah,
lease
yeah.
time.
Yeah. Okay, other,
Going forward after the town.
others for this, advantages, disadvantages to this
It
option.
gives the public back control of the corridor.
And there's a long list of why that's a good thing, but I don't know if we're gonna do it today or not.
Subject to that. If you refinance it, the debt holder is gonna affect limitations.
Well, this is we buy out the contract and the cell operator was told.
I'm just saying, if it's debt, subject to debt not covered.
Yeah. Then I'm gonna let you
But if we
shut
buy
it
it out,
down.
then we don't have any debt.
If you use 100% cash, which is a hard stretch, but yes.
Yeah, it's a stretch.
Other advantages.
Prioritization process.
Hmm?
I think your con would be the SDI prioritization.
Being part of it.
Requiring STI prioritization.
I think one big pro is it likely offers the state more flexibility in adapting to new technology over the next 5 decades. Subject to it not impacting the debt, which is all of that, but I'm a pretty big believer of mass transit. 30 years is automated, not the way we think of it today. But we have to control the asset to be able to do that.
Why?
Or buy out the contract.
Public transportation can use them.
Well, but if you do automated, if automated gets rid of the need for the toll lane for a guaranteed travel time, how do you monetize? How do you do that?
You can have it per dollar.
So,
Okay, can we go?
so like we'd offer, yeah, and this is one where if you've got a different perspective or a downside of that, can list that as well.
To me, one of the pros in this is that our toll money will actually stay in the state of North Carolina instead of a foreign country.
Right.
I think that's been one of the toughest pills for me to swallow.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is one of the cons is we're still paying toll money for infrastructure improvements when we haven't had any north-south capacity on this region for 40 years.
I agree.
The shorthand of that is it's still tolled.
Yeah.
This might tie into Mr. Puckett, but the other win is we do get our air rights back, which could have value, and our right-of-way back.
You own the right. Still on the right.
All right, we keep it up to 50.
It enhances our
I won't own it for the rest of
I
my
know where
life.
you're going.
It enhances our creativity to figure out how to leverage the revenue piece of it. Because there's not a bucket of cash sitting around for us to grab. And anybody who believes that, you really need to think about it. So we need to figure out how to leverage the revenue we're gonna have, whether we like it or not. It's there, but we need to figure out how we can be smart and negotiate and leverage that revenue side.
More advantages? Let's start with Ajit. Different disadvantages that haven't been identified?
Well, it does give you the advantage of you can add capacity, et cetera, in the future without having to negotiate with a third party.
Yeah, any decision you make now is your own, not somebody else's.
You can add capacity without there being any, repercussions, so whatever that is.
Which goes back to your flexibility.
Yeah, it is flexibility piece, yeah.
Control your destiny.
You do have the option to,
Should we hold hands and say kumbaya?
not quite yet.
There's a lot of pros to this option.
Con is no known source of funding.
Oh, I know the source of funding is the taxpayer. It's a known source of funding, it's just a matter of how you're gonna get to them.
A lot of other interstates have source of funding.
I don't care if it's a toll or a tax, it's the same guy. Or girl.
Okay.
Or do I need to throw a third one in there now?
Given the time, I want to take a couple of minutes to figure out where we go next, because I'm thinking it's not enough time to complete F at this point.
Do we
Option F.
just start with F?
And I think there could be, some value in introducing the evaluation matrix that we had talked about using for the next time. It's just that we now will have one more to discuss in the next meeting before getting to that. But that was the last thing on your agenda that we had mentioned, is that to allow you to do that kind of side-by-side comparison at the next meeting, that there's an evaluation matrix that we wanted to show you and see if generally that structure looks like it will work for you. Is that accurate?
Is there a slide for that?
Yes, there is, but just kind of want to make sure, so we're not going to initiate F, we'll just go to the matrix and then, because we made an attempt to put together what I call a blank matrix based on how you all are defining the pros and cons at the last meeting. These are the major items that we heard. We are certainly going to look at the pros and cons we mentioned today to see if we need to add any more columns. But our intention is to basically, after we discuss option F, we go to a matrix like that, which we would basically look at each of the options all the way from A through F, and for each option, we basically, I think, I don't remember exactly who mentioned at the last meeting, but somebody mentioned, or maybe a couple of you mentioned, that it would be good to have all these side by side. So that is the intention. So there may not be a whole lot of new information in this, maybe the impacts to PA, but for the most part, this is the information we presented at the last meeting versus this and the next meeting. Yes, ma'am.
Coming specifically out of this meeting, we're not going to add a column about control, state control versus operator control.
Yeah, we had, well, I should probably, read the headings. I know you have a printout. So what we see on the left is basically each row is an option going A through F. And then what we are calling evaluation factors, basically cost impacts, schedule impacts. To open the project, if you remember the chart that kind of shows different elements that would take us to have an open facility, and whether it requires STS scoring or not, because there is potentially a significant impact on the schedule. CRTP approval, some options require it, some don't. What is the action needed in contract? Are we talking about a modification, which is what most of CR, or are we looking at a termination of the contract? Is it state operated? Yes or no? We talked about some potential benefits of having a state operated I-77 facility. Whether the option you're looking at includes a tolling or not, because we looked at option B, where it will go back to CRTPO, potentially that may or may not include tolling. So that's where this comes into play. And then reliable travel time, whether the given option maintains the reliable travel time the current project does, or it changes that in any manner, or basically takes away by if we don't have a toll lane. Whether the given option adds any general purpose lanes, again, going back to potentially option B or something, or possibly option F. And then finally, do we have impacts to the bonus allocation projects? Yes or no?
Yeah.
So that is the intent? Yes, sir.
Kind of a mixed bag, because, cost impacts, if it's high, that's negative, right? Some might look at includes tolling. Well, to me, that's, as you can guess, that's a negative, but, are we saying that that's a positive?
Each column could be a negative or column, but positive, they're not all gonna be higher or lower.
Yeah, reliable travel time. Yeah. Don't know how that one got on there. We're missing a couple of big ones. Reduces congestion.
I presume that's what it adds general purpose lane capacity.
Positive, okay, but let's just say that.
Right.
Let's just say
Thank
that. Reduces congestion and positive economic impact.
On this, also that we did a parking lot for D, and I think we need to perhaps not be locked in on a number of rows, because I think there are a few additional rows that, while Jim did an excellent job in his report, I would argue through this discussion, there might be some other options or variations of options that we need to have. So I'm leery to lock us in on these are the rows.
Fully understand.
G. Option to be named later.
There are only 26 letters in the alphabet, so.
Or it could be D1, D2, D3.
True.
Various points there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think that is something that for meeting 6 to spend some time saying what are other ideas for how to address, mobility issues in the corridor, then those could then end up being added to the rows. So these could be added to the columns, reducing congestion, positive economic impact. You've identified a couple issues with the columns that are currently there in terms of, is everybody going to be weighing them in the same direction in terms of what's positive and what's negative? Other either factors that you think should be included based on the discussion you've had so far that haven't been addressed? Or other concerns that you would have about even how this matrix could be used?
Yeah, we mentioned that, yeah.
I think one good data point for this is, what is the updated completion date and what confidence do you have they're going to hit that date? Because some of these have, a 2 to 3 year timeline on it, so it would be good to know when this thing is finished.
anticipated completion date of the
Okay.
project.
And is that, I wasn't sure if that's for the matrix or whether that's a question to answer.
Is that, you're talking about the
Is
project
that
now?
a question you
Yeah,
want
yeah, the
answered
project
for
right
this?
now, yeah, the
That
project right now,
So
as
that-
designed,
well,
as
that answers the
contract,
list
is the
of
whole
questions.
matter.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think, and if you did it when I was ill, I apologize, but I also mentioned, I'd love DOT to weigh in from somebody on the job sites from NC to D. I would love to get a feel for what is the quality of a project we're getting relative to a state-built interstate. I mean, only because they've got a history of cutting corners and doing things, I think they need to be watched a little closer, and do we have the quality control that, I'd love a quality statement of what we're getting.
Or maybe separate from the meeting, we could do something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This doesn't mean that these are the only factors we have. We can, I'm sure as we are talking through option F or as we start discussing this, additional items may come in. So please don't look at it as we are locked in, this is all we can look at, absolutely not. But this, at least we'll bring this information so we can continue the discussion. If there are no questions, then I will basically go to. You want to touch anything on the?
Yeah, we will, so one of the things that we will do between this meeting and meeting 6 is reassess how much we can realistically do in that meeting, because I know there's some of the information requests you had from meeting number 4 will be coming back for the next meeting. We'll be sharing that as well as more that you've generated here. You know you're going to need to do the analysis on complete and delete, and then start both tackling the matrix and brainstorming perhaps new things beyond these Mercator options. We had said a while back that in order for you to influence this project, we really want to wrap this advisory group's work up by the end of April. We currently have one meeting scheduled in April. I think one of the things we'll be doing, the planning group, as we go back and look at this, is does it make sense to try to schedule one more past that, because right now it's something like you may have an awful lot to pack into that April 16th meeting, so stay tuned on that.
Thank you again for coming out and doing this. Just two things. One is, to Commissioner Cotham's point, public trust is something that you need to build here in North Mecklenburg. And the press has done a good job in painting a worst-case scenario on what we're doing. The last thing I'd want to see is you guys, and I don't think this will happen, is to fade away when our work is done with the advisory group. So I think there needs to be a little more proactive approach to the press for what we're doing here, because again, the press is controlling the narrative. From a second point is, I want to make sure that as we wrap this up and we come up with D1 through 10 or whatever those other options are, that we start to get a little more interaction with the transportation professionals here, so that we're not going down a rat hole that is not, could not work or whatever. So, I understand you want to keep your cars close to the vest, but I think it's important that you start to share what your thoughts could be on this, and again, another option to potentially go into closed session, because those would be private thoughts, not publicly available. Thank you.
One more. Quick request. You got this here. Could somebody just give me like a list of acronyms?
What you're holding up is the lender's downside case?
Yeah, which I understand what LDC is,
You
because
have
that's
that
the
too?
one that is defined. But when we get to the LBC, the TAZ,
Mr. Puckett, that was provided because a member asked to have the chart available, and so we want to provide context. I suggest let's do that at the next meeting.
and that's fine, I'm not thinking to discuss it, I just want to know when time comes.
We need to talk about that at the next meeting.
That's kind of what I'm, but I'd like to know what I'm talking about. Or at least,
Updating the 7 projects into completion, can you give an update on the bonus allocation projects that are underway and their completion date? I know it's a fiscal year, but is that the completion date expected, or are we on track for, I'm talking about the ones that have started. Can we put a firm date on
This is the year that these projects will start, this is not completion.
Okay, so the ones that have started, such as Davidson, can we get a completion date for those? That's
You can just put another column on there, estimated completion.
Okay, real quickly, especially since we're going into at least one more meeting, maybe two, it's very helpful to hear what's working for people, what's not. One thing I heard several folks mention today was how much they appreciate DOT presence continually here, so I'm gonna put that down.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I think we're starting to get some good cross dialogue, frankly. And I know the need to stay on the need to stay on agenda coupled with some of the dialogue has been good.
Yeah, that was, you know, we realized we didn't get through all of them today, but part of what I was thinking was, it's great to have people be talking across, so I didn't jump in too much on that. Anything else we do differently, either between meetings or at meetings that would be helpful to you?
But the good news is you didn't jump in, I appreciate that too. I don't mean that as a positive. I appreciate the facilitation of kind of being.
Not facilitating.
Lack of facilitating. Appreciating the ebb and flow. Sometimes people get so hung up on getting through the agenda that they
Miss the point.
miss the point of being here altogether.
So I guess a specific question on that is, and I'm gathering from what people said this seemed okay, but is it creating any problems for you that we did not get through the analysis of the complete and delete options at this meeting?
Not
Is
in the
there-
least. Not in the least.
No.
Okay.
It's a process.
Be thorough than fast.
It's been 2.5 years with one more.
All
Speak
right.
for yourself. And 5.
Then if there's nothing else for the good of the order, we travel safely, and our next meeting is Monday, April 16th, 1 to 3, yes. Okay? Same time, same station.
Russ, good to see you again.